Aloha everyone, and welcome to the planet Grom, where we aim to show people the world around them with videos, answering questions, and seeing sights on motorcycles. And in this episode, we're talking about why the Honda Ruckus is a perfect parent-child project. I know, it's a channel called the planet Grom, but this is one of those rare cases where the Grom isn't the absolute best option for the challenge, which is a parent-child project. Okay, so here's a little story before we begin. When I was a kid, my parents split up and my mom started dating this guy named Steve. Steve was classic cool. He had a motorcycle, a truck, and not one but two classic Chevelles. He and his friends were always hanging out in his garage or he was hanging out in theirs. They were constantly working on their cars or just chatting, friend stuff. He's a super friendly guy too. He never banned my brother or me from the garage because it was some sort of man space or because we might see or hear something inappropriate for our little eyes or ears. In fact, things seemed more open and honest in the garage, and I could ask questions that I didn't feel comfortable asking anywhere else. A radio was always on and playing country at a low volume, and the temperature always seemed just right. It was comfortable. Sometimes in the evenings I would go out to his garage and I would just stare at his Chevelles. He's got a red 1965 Chevelle, and it is just, it's just perfect. He would take my mom out on dates with my brother and me in tow, and we would all go out to eat, and on the way back, he would gun it over this tiny hill in front of his house, and it would make my stomach lift up. Between the roaring engine and the exhilaration of cresting a hill at speed, I was in love with that car. And things were getting pretty serious between him and my mom. As 6th grade came to a close, I was looking into the future. My best friend lived next door, and we were going to be going to junior high together. We would also end up going to high school together. And I would bet that we would go to the same college too. At least, I was really hoping, because he was way better at math than me and I needed all the help that I could get. We even had to watch this video about going to junior high and how it was really the gateway to adulthood, and so much different than elementary school. Things are changing at school, at home, on your body, and everywhere you look. And that's when I got the idea for the car. I figured I would do chores and save up allowances and buy some cheap beater of a classic car, and then Steve and I could restore it bit by bit. We'd replace this part, refurbish that part, and all along the way I would learn not only how to be a good car guy, but how to be a good man. I've been fortunate to have a few strong male role models in my life, but Steve was probably the best. He always had a good time and laughed a lot. He was always kind, but you knew that he could throw down if he needed to. He was smart, but he was also quiet. He didn't feel the need to impress anyone, and he was always content with himself. You always felt like he cared about you and would always be there if you needed him, and he always treated my mom well. And cars? Yeah, he knew it all. So I wanted to build a car with him, and I knew it would take forever. I didn't care. I could spend years in his garage putting together my own car, and when it was finally ready, I'd be able to drive it to school, and I would know every knock and tick that the car would have to offer. If anything went screwy, I would have an idea what it was. I would be a car guy. And I'd slowly be mentored into being a good person in general. These were the dreams of me as a 6th grader. It didn't work out that way, though. Just before 6th grade finished, I moved in with my dad, and we were unable to work on a car. Not that that was a bad thing. He was in the Navy, and that presented all sorts of complications. We never had a garage in any of the houses we lived in, for instance, and working on your car on the street on a military base is generally frowned upon. Not only that, but we would have had to drag the car and its parts behind us whenever we moved, and we moved just about every year and a half. Now, I know that you can't change the past, and choosing to move in with my dad had a lot of benefits. Life in general would be dramatically different based on that one decision, and the results would have probably not been as great. Especially when I think about my awesome wife and my amazing kids. I wouldn't give those things up for anything in the world, mostly because they are my world. But it's still kind of a regret that it never happened, because I know Steve and I could have made a pretty awesome car. I'm fond of his Chevelle, obviously, but they're pricey, and I think I would have gone with a '63 Ford Falcon Sprint convertible in baby blue. It was never a fast car, but if you couldn't tell by my Ruckus or Grom, I'm not exactly interested in fast. And while I learned a lot about being a good person without doing a restoration project in the garage, I think I came across the lessons a bit harder than I would have if I'd stayed with my mom. Anyway, it's always been there in the back of my mind as a potential path that could have been taken but wasn't, and really, there's no point in dwelling on it now as a full-blown adult. You can't go back, and even if you could, would you really want to and risk changing all the good things that have happened in your life since? But regret isn't a bad thing at all, because it means that you could use it to make a change and impact the future. Like, even though it didn't happen for me, it doesn't mean that I can't make it happen for someone else. Maybe I could be someone's Steve, Also, the dream of building a car it's all well and good, but it's probably a huge pain when you break it down, and I had no idea of the gravity of the task involved as a little kid. You have the size of the car, for one thing. It takes up a lot of space, and you need to find a place for it to occupy while you work on it for an unknown amount of time. And then, you need to find spots for all the parts until you can put them on the car, a lot of which aren't exactly small. And before you even find a spot for the parts, you need to buy them. And a lot of car stuff isn't cheap, or sometimes even easy to find in the first place. A lot of the time, you're dealing with stuff that weighs a ton as well. And then there's the sheer amount of parts you're required to have, and not just parts either, but things that connect the parts to parts, like nuts, bolts, screws, etc. And you'll need the tools to connect said parts. I mean, it's a bear when you think about it, but it would still be fun to do a project like that. I mean, I would think. But then I got my Honda Ruckus, and as I began to modify it, I realized that this would be the perfect project for a tiny aspiring mechanic. I mean, think about it. Scooters, they don't take up much space. And parts for scooters are light, small, and the aftermarket for the Ruckus is ridiculous, so everything is easy to find and a lot of times cheap. You could buy a used Ruckus and completely rebuild it fairly easily. There was a guy who lost his Ruckus, and a group project was started to send him the parts to build a new one. Not to buy him a Ruckus and send him some aftermarket parts. The whole thing arrived in pieces, and he was able to build this new Ruckus. It can be done. And there's a solid Ruckus scene on the internet that is more than happy to help you if you get stuck on a project. And that means that even if you aren't mechanically inclined, you can still use the resources available to you from Facebook, where you can ask your questions, or YouTube, where you can watch tutorials, and you can learn some new skills for yourself. There's also the fact that when you're done and you let your kid ride it, they'll have a harder time killing themselves than on a Grom. With the Grom, you sit up high and there's more speed on tap, but on a Ruckus, you sit lower, presuming you did one of the first easy mods and put a lower seat on it. And the lower center of gravity means balancing is easier. And even if they grabbed a whole handful of throttle, the acceleration is still way more slow than on a Grom. Of course, all of this requires a kid that wants to learn and work on the project, and that's the snag, but I think there's a lot of draw to this. I mean, I never wanted to rebuild a car just because I wanted a cool car. It was the time that I would have spent with Steve that I valued the most, and that's where most of the regret that I have from not doing it comes from. But like I said before, regret could be used as fuel for change, and instead of being bummed that I didn't get the mentor or project that I wanted, I could use that fuel and become the mentor I want to be to my own kids. So when my daughter asked if we could work on the Ruckus together and make it even crazier than it already is, I said, of course we could. I mean, it'll have to wait until we move back to the mainland, so we won't have to worry about expensive shipping for parts or corrosive air, but yeah, we could definitely do it. We may even be able to move somewhere where the Ruckus in its modified form is street legal. How cool would that be? She's been helping me with the Ruckus for over a year now, handing me tools, tightening bolts, and doing odd jobs. The Ruckus just makes sense because there's almost nothing on it that couldn't be at least put in place by a kid. I mean, sure, an adult might need to tighten things up to where they need to be, and it's not like you would want your kid messing around with the electronics on their own, but with you, it would be perfect. You could take your time and work on it slowly. Tackle up project after project in your off times, on weekends, or in the evenings after dinner. Just go into the garage, turn on some music low enough to fill any silences, and work on whatever mod you're up to. Sometimes you work in silence or talk only about the project, but that doesn't mean that those are your limits. Talk to them about life, your day, their day. Open up. Mentor them. Make the garage a place where they can be unafraid to open up and be honest with what's going on in their life. Build the bond and make it worth it. At the end of it, we should have a pretty cool Ruckus, sure, but hopefully we'll have an even closer bond, and that sweet Ruckus will only be a bonus. So what do you think? Is the Ruckus a good parent-child project? Did you do projects like these as kids? Are you planning on doing them with your kids? Let me know in the comments below, and until next time, mahalo nui loa.